Welcome to Infant and Toddler Development. Today we're here at Triton College at the Communication Department recording our first podcast for our program. Today our topic will be about genetics, the foundation of life, where you get your eye color from, where you get your straight or curly hair from. We're going to talk about all of these today in our session with Dr. Khan and Dr. Chan. Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll start with Dr. Khan. Let us know who you are and why you know so much about genetics.
Well, thank you so much. I am Professor Anwar Khan, and by training, I am a biochemist. I have a PhD in biochemistry from Louisiana State University, lots of research experience, and at Triton College, I teach biology and biotechnology courses. And genetics is one of the things that we cover in depth in lots of courses. So, since it's the fundamental for everything that a person does, and be susceptible to, perhaps, or all the characteristics, so it is important that we should talk about genetics.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Dr. Chan, introduce us to you.
Sure. So my name is Richard Chan. I am a professor of microbiology as well as human anatomy and physiology at Triton. I've been here for just over 10 years now. My background is mostly in the healthcare field. So I have a bachelor's in microbiology, and then I have a master's as well in micro. And then I went to medical school. So I graduated med school and then went back and decided I love school, and so I went back and did a master's in molecular biology. So I have some of that as well. Not as much research for sure, but my big focus is the healthcare field. So I have a lot of students who are going to be health driven, nursing, doctors, pharmacists, etc.
Okay.
And so again, a lot of that comes from looking at genetics and dealing with a lot of the different features of how it can affect our lives in many ways.
Those are really cool, like different stories too of how you got to the same place, teaching similar classes, right? Um, to talk about genetics to all of us. It's amazing. Dr. Khan, can you introduce us to what is genetics?
Okay, so let's delve into it. So, it's a fascinating field. Think about the moment we are conceived, all the way from that point on, the genetic program dictates what is going to happen to us. So, all of it starts not really after birth, but way before that, even in our mother's womb, how we are developing and how that genetic program controls just about every aspect of who we are going to be. So think about, for example, very early on, or think about the characteristics that a person is going to have. For example, a child, when they develop, they may have the eyes of their mother. Maybe they have some dimples that resemble their father, or maybe curly hair that resemble one of their grandparents. So, how do those characteristics get transmitted to the person, a newborn, or upon conception? So we want to talk about all of that. And so the fundamental question that we should ask is, what is genetics then? So in its simplest terms, we could say is the transmission of traits, we call it, or characteristics from one generation to the next. And that depends on a very famous molecule, everybody knows it, DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So that's something we will be talking about today. And what are some of the properties that how these traits or characteristics get transmitted to the next generation? So we want to go all the way back at the moment of conception, and we want to say something about how the genetics of a male parent and a female parent mix.
You're talking about DNA as a part of this. And for me, my experience with DNA is the little cartoon thing from Jurassic Park. That's the only reason I remember what DNA is. Don't tell my science professors from when I was in college that that's all I remember. Can you tell us a little bit more about DNA and what it is and what its function is for us?
Well, certainly. So, we consider DNA in biological sciences as people would say as a software or as a recipe book that dictates just about everything. How you're going to grow, how you're going to develop, how your brain is going to develop. Are you going to be susceptible to some diseases? Maybe even personality traits, even perhaps even intelligence and other things. So we do need to know the structure in order to know its function. Just like you need to know how an engine works in order to be able to understand how the car moves. So deoxyribonucleic acid is an organic molecule and it holds information. It has a code. So I will say code, when we think about computer code, for example, those are just two digits, right? Zeros and ones. So you have those zeros and ones, and just based on those two digits, computers can do some marvelous things. The DNA code depends on four letters, something called A, T, C, and G. Those are chemicals. We call them nucleotides: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. You connect them in various sequences, just like 26 letters. You can write sentences, books, unlimited books, right? So we have these four letters and you can make codes out of it. So it codes for what? That's the question. It codes for proteins. So proteins are the actual hardware. In your muscles, for example, there are a whole bunch of proteins, two main ones, actin and myosin, we call them. When they slide past each other, that's how you contract your muscles. And that's how you lift things, walk, or even breathe, right? Um, then there's a protein called hemoglobin in your red blood cells. That has a very specific function that it carries oxygen for you. Insulin is a protein, and that is responsible for lowering your blood glucose. There's any defect in any aspect of that, people would have diabetes. Okay? So every single cell that we have in our bodies, we all started out as one cell. And I just want to take you back at that moment. So human beings, every single cell, with the exception of red blood cells, have 46 chromosomes. Okay? Red blood cells are slightly different. They live for 4 months in our bodies, and that's it. They're not trying
They
to
only
live
live for
forever.
4 months.
Yes,
Things you think I would know.
it's totally
Yeah.
fine. So, 46 chromosomes, that means 46 DNA molecules we have in every single cell. But those DNA molecules, they are in chromosomes. We have two of each. Okay? So we can say we have two sets of chromosomes. So basically, 23 chromosomes, that's one set. 23 chromosomes, that's another set. One set came from our male parent, the other set came from our female parent. And that's when they gave us 23 chromosomes in the egg, 23 chromosomes in the sperm, mix them. The fertilized egg is now called a zygote with all 46 chromosomes. No wonder all of us have characteristics of both parents, right?
Right.
So when we think about those 46 chromosomes and two sets, well, we have something called genes. Those are segments of DNA. They code for various proteins. So as I mentioned, we have actins and myosins, right, in our muscles. So we have genes for those. They code for those proteins. We have genes for insulin. We have genes for hemoglobin. Okay, several genes for globin, right? So you got two versions. So one came from, actually, let me back up a little bit. And let me just say chromosome number one, for example, all right? So you got two of those. One came from male, one came from female parent. That's a very long chromosome. 249 million of those nucleotides connected together. The total number of nucleotides, 3.2 billion or so, and 23 chromosomes, times two. Okay. So that's a lot of nucleotides.
That is quite a few.
Exactly. But the point here is out of those 249 million nucleotides, you have 1,900 genes on that one chromosome.
You have
Okay.
1,900 genes on that one chromosome.
So human beings have approximately 21,000 total genes. Actually, that was a surprise when we did the Human Genome Project. We were thinking at the very least 100,000 genes. So it was a shocker to people that we just got 21,000 genes for something this complex. But
So I always tell my students, like, we're complex people, and just thinking about how you are made. And granted, I don't teach the science of it, because that's why I have people like you to help me here. But I do talk about how it is kind of a cool scientific way to think about, hey, all of this worked together somehow and made exactly you.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So those 46 chromosomes, each one is in a pair. So two of ones, two of twos, two of chromosome 3, two of chromosome 4, so on and so forth, all the way to 22. So that's 44 chromosomes. Then, if you're a female, you got one X chromosome from your mom, one X chromosome from your father, and that's why you're a female. And then, if you're a male, then you got one X from your female parent and one Y chromosome from your male parent. So that's total of 46, a little bit different between males and females. So going back to 1,900 genes on chromosome number 1. So female parent gave one gene and the male parent, for example, gave one gene, let's say for the eye color, okay? So there are two genes and they could be same. For example, both gave the um, new person or the new generation brown version. So the kid is going to have brown eye. But genes work in a weird way where sometimes one gene we say is dominant over the other, meaning if it has one copy, if you have only one copy, it's going to exert its effect. So let's say the female parent gave a gene that would code for blue eye, but the father gave a gene that codes for brown eye. Brown is really dominant.
Yeah.
Kid is more likely gonna have brown eye. What would it take for a person to have blue or green eye, which is not so common, right?
See, and I'm wondering that because my dad has brown eyes and I have blue eyes, I believe. And my siblings do as well. So now I'm sitting here like, oh, tell me why I have blue eyes.
So, well, that's so there are other genes.
Yeah.
Eye color maybe is a
Mhm.
bad example because there
Yeah.
are several genes that control how the color will appear. Okay, so it's not always one gene.
Yeah.
But the point here is for some genes, you got to have two copies of the same, only then you would see the effect.
Mhm.
And I'm going to try to convince you with another example.
Okay.
Let's talk about sickle cell anemia. Okay. So, sickle cell anemia occurs because one of the globin genes, hemoglobin, that carries oxygen in our red blood cells, is defective. Okay. And believe you or not, you better believe that because it's a fact. We teach that
Mhm.
one nucleotide out of so many,
Mhm.
okay, in that gene is changed for something else. Just one in
That's why
that
you need
particular
to,
gene. That's all you need
Typo.
to one
it's a great way to
exactly
think of it is as a typo.
one typo, and that causes the whole disease. But how do we transmit it to the next generation? So think of it, male parent have two copies, right?
Mhm.
And let's say this male parent has one copy which is good and one copy which is bad. It would cause sickle cell. So does the male parent has the disease? No, one good copy is good. You're fine. How about the female parent? Let's say female parent is the same situation. One good copy, one bad copy. Female parent is also good.
Mhm.
So let's say now they make a baby. You see, it's a flip of a coin that male parent, if male parent gives the bad copy and the female parent gives the bad copy, the kid has no choice. Now both copies are defective. That baby is going to have sickle cell anemia. This is how genetics work. Not all genes are like that. Sometimes you just require one copy to have something bad. Okay?
It's like Huntington's does that.
Mhm.
Huntington's disease, exactly. There's another situation called achondroplasia. shorter stature,
Yeah.
that is also just one gene is required.
Moving this into early childhood development, in this class, we're talking specifically about infant and toddler development. So, a lot of things, a lot of questions that my students have are about where do genetics come into play? And there's a lot of misinformation that is circled around for years on early childhood development and what may or may not be genetically linked, such as autism or ADHD. So, what are some examples of the ways that genetics affects development, and as well as, are those misconceptions, or are they actually more truthful than what I realize?
So let's handle that in a couple of different ways. First,
Mhm.
perhaps we can take a look at some very specific examples of
Yeah.
what genes are involved in brain development. It's an amazing organ, in addition to heart and perhaps other organs as well,
Mhm.
but keeps working 24/7, never
Yeah.
stops. Um, but its development is complicated and regulated by, you guessed it, the genes, right? There is a um, example, for example, FOXP2 gene. Right? This is in biology, in biochemistry, medical sciences, we call it a transcription factor. Those are really important in how the organs develop early on and then maintain them throughout the life, right? So there's FOXP2. That's a really important one for speech language development during early brain development and childhood growth. So if there's some defect in that gene, and that could happen, perhaps genetics that it was inherited that way, but DNA could get damaged because of environmental factors, right?
Yes.
So this is where Dr. Chan will talk a little bit more about that. Uh, but this is where genetics, in combination with environment, perhaps radiation or smoking, or maybe other ways that DNA could get damaged. So that's one example.
Mhm.
Then there's another one, something called BDNF, or brain derived neurotropic factor.
Yeah.
Those are really important proteins, important genes that will keep all your brain cells working in tip top shape.
Mhm.
Remember that brain cells, they need to make all the connections. That's why we say keep the young, even the newborn, or even before birth, engaged. Some people would play music or always have good thoughts, nutrition's absolutely pristine, no toxins hopefully coming in, because for that development it's needed. So both genes and the environmental factors are needed for proper growth
Mhm.
of all organs, but definitely brain development. And any
Mhm.
defect in any of these processes could lead to a whole variety of disorders. Autism spectrum disorder is one, um, ADHD perhaps, for both genetic reasons and perhaps other reasons
Mhm.
that Dr. Chan will talk about a little bit
Yeah.
more. So I don't know if
Yeah,
you want
Dr.
to
Chan,
jump
do you
in.
want to jump in?
Yeah. So we were, kind of talking about how we kind of have the genes, and I kind of like display explaining it like the genes set
Mhm.
the foundations, right? They set up all the pieces, and then the environment will then change and affect how the structures are put in place. So, like Dr. Khan mentioned, we have the BDNF, right? The factor that causes brain development. And so that could then create the foundations. But then, as we are born later and go through life and experience and exposed to different things like microorganisms and bacteria. So, especially with autism spectrum disorders, we're seeing a lot of relationships between that nature and nurture side where the nature gives you the genes, right? But then the nurture, how we are born, vaginally versus even
Mhm.
C-section determines that. We also then look at things like how we are raised culturally, where we're raised,
Mhm.
what and who we're exposed to, because the other bacteria we encounter build into what we call the microbiome. Probably heard there's lots of bacteria in our
Yeah.
body and our skin, right? So those microbes actually also influence our genes as well, and they also influence our health in a bigger spectrum. So when we're talking about autism spectrum disorders, right, they're more just a disorder. So it's more just things are not balanced correctly. And so working differently as well. And so we can manage it and really make sure that we improve any issues that patients or folks may have with autism spectrum disorders, but it's not going to go away completely, but we can make some of the difficult problems less difficult.
I've often heard ADHD and autism being compared to diabetes, where it's not something to be ashamed of or afraid of. It's just you have symptoms of something that you have to treat, which is a different mindset.
Yeah, when we look at it that way, right? So diabetes, we have a full, we can really break it down completely to the
Yeah.
medical level of dysregulation of insulin, right? But then when we're starting to see something like autism spectrum disorders, and any of that spectrum as well, there's just so many different things that go into it. So there's no one real cause, right? There's a
Yes.
lot of things that go into it. And ultimately, what it comes out to is it's just a different way of thinking and a different way of behaving than what we generally, think about in terms of society. But it's not anything, wrong and it's not anything abnormal. It's just different.
Yeah.
And so it's just a different, way of how the genes are working or how the proteins are laid down, right? And different pathways in the brain. So again, it's just getting to the same point in just different routes.
Yeah.
And so just kind of making sure that we can try to um, stabilize that and make it more consistent for
Yes.
folks.
And I know, oh, sorry, not
Just
you.
want
Yeah,
to add something.
absolutely. Please add.
I just wanted to say, the autism spectrum or ADHD, I mean, those disorders are just so complex.
Mhm.
As Dr. Chen mentioned, that yeah, we know certain things, but we don't know all the details. And
Yeah.
I like to think of it as in comparison to, for example, type 2 diabetes. Why don't we have a cure, even though we know quite a bit, but we don't know everything?
Yeah.
So the disease is just so complex,
Mhm.
what goes on inside the cell. Yeah, we are ahead in comparison to ADHD and
Mhm.
autism spectrum when we think about type 2 diabetes.
Mhm.
Hopefully, in a number of years, we will catch up in terms of we will know a lot more
Mhm.
and will be able to say that, okay, these are perhaps the problem spots that
Mhm.
we could do something about.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
That is, yeah. Um, so going back a little bit to something I asked, with one of the misconceptions that I frequently get from students is nature versus nurture. These specific things, and I love how you guys talked about autism and ADHD, but it's very frequently like this specifically causes autism, vaccines cause autism, television causes ADHD.
Sure.
Is there any truth or foundation in that?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's really most of these are going to be genetic at the end of the
Yeah.
day. So when we're looking at, like we said, laying down the framework, right? So it's just setting things up so that it's going to appear this way or function this way. But then there's really looking at when we have other issues, there's going to be a lot of other environmental factors that come in as well that
Yes.
may interplay with all of it. But at the moment, there's nothing, at least in terms of when we're looking at something like ADHD, outside of the genetic level at this point, nothing solid
Yes.
yet. There's a lot of confounding factors that we'd have to investigate further, at
Yeah.
least not in what I've seen. And then autism spectrum as well, very similar to, there's again a lot of, call it multifactorial
Yeah.
causes that lead up to it. So not at the moment, no absolute cause that we can say, yes, this is it.
Yes.
But there's a lot of things that will be interplaying.
Yeah, and the interplay of experience is a huge thing because I know we're going to talk about this not in this session, but later I'll be talking with someone about social emotional development and how trauma can cause symptoms that are similar to ADHD while not being ADHD. So there's a lot of also those moving pieces. And with infants and toddlers, we don't often see a diagnosis for these before the age of 3. So we're not really seeing a lot of these diagnoses anyway at this stage. When we're thinking about laying these foundations of genetics, a lot of this is happening in the womb. When we're thinking about gestational phase of development, how is this looking for our budding infants and toddlers?
Sure. So Dr. Khan was talking earlier about the beginning, right? So
Yeah.
we have the sperm and the egg coming
Mhm.
together to make the cell, and then that forms the zygote. And that's when we start having human development in the womb. And that's where we start to get into the gestational side. So as those cells are dividing, those cells are going to quickly start to make lots of copies, and that will go through a phase of what we call embryogenesis, where we're making the embryo. And so the cells are going to start to form some of the early foundation. So you may have seen some of those pictures. They look like little like animal-like things, right? The
Yes.
tail. We actually have a tail at beginnings.
Mhm.
And so those embryos are going to start to develop for the first about 8 weeks. It's about 2 months of development. And then after that, we start having the organogenesis, which is the organs developing. So that's when we start creating different things like your nervous system and your brain development, as well as your heart, your lungs, all of that starts to lay down about 2 months in. So around week 9, 10-ish, you may have a very minor heartbeat. You can have a heartbeat just activating on its own, but it's not, anything other than just a bunch of cells,
Yeah.
stimulating. And at that point, we can start to have a lot of problems. So gestational time, you probably are aware, especially with, anyone who's pregnant, they're going to have a lot of things to avoid at that
Yes.
point.
I've also heard some people say, to quote like How I Met Your Mother. I don't know if either of you watched that show, where there's the doctor on the show that says just a little bit.
Mhm.
And I've had a lot of friends who are pregnant. They're like, I can have just a little bit of this.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I also like to say the dose makes the poison.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
yeah, it is, very much so. I mean, it is much so just a little bit,
Yeah.
but it should, of course, be avoided if possible. But most of the time, it is really the dosage.
Yeah.
But at this point, we do see a lot of issues where we can have abnormalities coming
Mhm.
in. So even just at the genetic level, right, when the cells are dividing, as we were talking earlier about the two chromosomes coming from each parent, right? So when the parents are making those chromosomes in the sperm and the eggs, we go through a cell division process called meiosis. And meiosis, this DNA will start to separate into the chromosome.
Mhm.
And then sometimes they don't fully separate either. So even before we're even born, we can have issues at the genetic level of chromosomal abnormalities.
Down syndrome.
Down syndrome, that's a great example called trisomy 21, where we have tri meaning three, we have three chromosomes of chromosome 21. And so normally, like we said, we have two, right? But then somebody with Down syndrome will have an extra chromosome. And that
Okay.
will then lead to developmental delays and a lot of other, there's actually a lot of medical problems like cancers that are more prevalent as well in folks with
Really?
Downs. Yeah. So they tend to have a lot of leukemias and a lot of learning disorders in general and a lot of behavioral issues down the road later. But that can happen. And we also see this happening in a lot of cases as well, where we have a lot of patients with, even sex chromosome abnormalities as well. So Klinefelter's is where the patients get one Y chromosome and then they get an X chromosome, but they can get an extra X chromosome up to, I think I've seen like 4 or 5 X
Mhm.
chromosomes. So Klinefelters, they tend to have male appearing parts, but they also are often not able to reproduce
Mhm.
because their chromosomes don't pass down properly, as well as they have a lot of learning defects, as well as they have some behavioral problems, and they may also have a lot of other um, developmental delays and things like that later.
Yeah.
But then we also have the female version, which is Turner syndrome, where it's an XO. So they get an X from one parent and then they lose another chromosome. So they actually have 45 instead of 46 chromosomes. So again, they appear more female, but again, they also have issues with having children and reproducing. And also there's often higher risk for developmental delays and a lot of issues where they have social emotional learning
Mhm.
dysfunction as well. So we see a lot of these coming in from even just at the simple genetic level. But then we also have chemical problems that can come in too. So genetics can affect how we have learning and delayed disabilities for learning, but so can chemical exposures. And so that again during gestation, as you mentioned, right, having just a little bit. So we hear a lot about fetal alcohol syndrome.
Mhm.
So again, alcohol can cause a lot of developmental delays.
So
Again,
that's one not to have just a little bit of.
well, technically, again, yes,
Yeah.
it is. So usually, when they say that, it's like, one glass of wine or something periodically
And it's
is
one
not,
actual pour of wine, like
yes,
whatever,
one
like the
normal,
actual,
yeah,
not whatever you just slug into your cup. Yeah.
right. So, when you say like a
Mhm.
cup, right,
Yeah.
that usually is not going to be a problem. If you have one or two glasses when you're pregnant, not an issue. But I usually like to say, don't be drinking a whole bottle, right?
Yes.
What are your thoughts about smoking does not apply, that does not
Smoking,
apply to smoking,
that
right?
does not apply to cigarettes. No,
Yeah.
do want to avoid that as
Not
well.
just one or
Yes.
two.
Yeah.
Because that can
None.
affect the DNA, right?
That's
That
right.
can actually cause kinks in the DNA as well as damaging the DNA for causing more mutations,
Yeah.
and that can lead to more developmental and even physical changes as well to the developing fetus. And
Yes.
so that is another big one. Radiation, another huge one. X-rays, gamma ray exposure, right? That can also cause DNA damage and then ultimately fetal malformations and also deficiencies. So we also hear pregnant women need to increase their folic acid levels because folic acid is important for neural tube and brain development, and especially the early first few weeks is actually when it's really, really important. So again, we have to think about not only chemical exposure, but then nutritional deficiencies and loss of some of these nutrients that are essential to developing fetuses.
Yeah.
And eventually that will go into DNA production because those are actually used, folic acid is used to create DNA.
Right.
Yeah.
So then again, we're losing the pieces that go into it. So we have a lot of that kind of going in. And even you may have also heard of there's a drug that was used a long, long time ago.
Yes.
And so what we can see at this point, when we have chemical exposures that may lead to developmental damage,
Mhm.
we have things called teratogens. And teratogens are often medications or drugs. And the most famous one was in the 1950s, I believe, 50s and 60s. There was a drug called thalidomide to treat morning sickness in pregnant patients. It was pretty effective in that. However, they did not realize that it also led to a lot of limb development issues. So a lot of the kids, unfortunately, born were missing
10,000
limbs.
of them.
Yeah, they had oh, is that many?
It was in Europe, by the way.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't know if you want to add
Oh
that.
yeah, no.
It was all in Europe.
Mhm.
It never came to US.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
That.
yeah, so
No.
there was this, that was actually the birth of FDA. Was this woman,
Makes sense.
Frances Kelsey, who was adamant that there is no testing on this. She had a tiny office in a corner, and this woman fought and fought, wouldn't let this thing come in the US.
Yeah.
And when they got to know what happened, then she received President Kennedy, gave her all sorts of awards and all that.
Yeah.
That's when FDA was formed, that we need oversight.
All over early development.
Yeah.
Correct.
Which is incredible that someone stepped in.
Yeah.
Unfortunate that it happened to have people step in.
Yeah.
But you were anything else we should know about this?
Well, it's
Mhm.
interesting because, yeah, so thalidomide ended up leading to these defects. And if you look up the pictures, if you like search for them online, they're very, I mean, they're definitely going to be some defects. I think some folks actually have like,
So just
yeah, they're like
all
missing the limbs.
all
Yeah.
four.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then sometimes I saw a couple with like flippers and things too. And like,
Do you
when they're
mean flippers like?
yeah, like fins.
Deformed.
Yeah. They're
Oh,
like partially formed.
okay.
And yeah, so we've gone back since because it was no longer used for a long time, but then we've gone back now and it's been reformulated now to treat cancer, multiple myeloma, in fact.
Oh,
So so when we see these chemicals, right, we do of course have to avoid them during pregnancy. And for many, especially pregnant patients, you also may be aware that we do a lot of pregnancy testing for
mhm.
treating it with antibiotics because even a
Yes.
lot of our medications, Schedule F drugs, right? Those drugs have to be completely avoided in pregnant patients because they can also lead to other damaging effects.
Yes.
And that's just at the chemical level,
Mhm.
because even beyond that, the microbial level, infectious diseases. So one of my big passion, infectious diseases also cause a lot of problems as well. At that time, we call them torch infections. It's a mnemonic. Torch stands for toxoplasmosis,
Yeah.
which you may have heard of, which is found in cat feces. So
Right,
women have to avoid cats because of toxo.
Do they have to completely avoid cats?
Well, more
cleaning their
feral, yeah.
poop, I guess.
Yeah,
Okay.
feral cats is the bigger issue, feral and stray
So if
cats.
someone has a cat and they're pregnant, it's more you want to avoid cleaning the litter box.
Because you can
Right.
breathe it in and then it can
Ah.
get into the brain.
So, because I knew that about cats,
Yeah.
but I'm also like future thinking, like if I ever want to have a child, I'm like, I'm not giving up my cat.
Yeah.
Cats are okay. Just the
They
Yes.
test for them. They test for it at the vet.
have your husband clean
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, good
Yes,
job.
exactly. So
Yeah.
if women don't have someone with them and they do own a cat already, like, is there like ways to prevent it then, like
Sure, yeah.
masking or
Most of the
gloves?
time, you can also, it's actually generally destroyed by our immune system.
Okay.
Just don't know if we have immunity to it or not.
Mhm.
So that's part of the issue. And then if you do have cats, you can always take them into the vet, just bring a, fecal sample, and then they can test for it. And then you can know right off the bat. So
Yeah.
it's pretty simple.
We say usually cats have it, but
Not
um,
all. Most don't, but
most don't.
no, but
Because
it
I have
is
heard the
found.
other
It
way.
is housed in
Okay,
cats.
got it.
That's really
Yeah. And
interesting.
pigs, but most people.
Most people don't
Got
keep as well. If you're living in an urban area, if you're living in more a rural area, you might have more exposure to pigs. But I
That's one
know,
of the big ones.
yeah, because I remember working in the infant classroom, and sometimes there'd be Irish twins where like a mom would bring in her child and she'd be pregnant already.
Mhm.
Not that that's a bad thing, but we'd get like a thing going through our classroom, like hand, foot, and mouth disease,
Yep.
and then we wouldn't see mom for like 3 weeks. We'd only see dad. So with
Another
that,
one of the
that's
torch.
another one of them.
Yeah, so the T is toxo,
Mhm.
O is for other, so that
Yeah.
would include things like parvovirus, which is hand, foot, mouth disease.
Yes. It's
And then
horrible to get as an adult,
Varicella.
by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's nasty.
especially in
Oh,
kids.
stay
It's
away.
actually another big one that we
Yeah.
have to test for. So the torches can cross the placenta. Those are the microbes that
Yeah.
are not as well protected. So parvo can actually lead to it's called erythroblastosis vitalis. Basically, it will attack, cause the immune system, the mom, to attack the newborn fetus and their red blood cells.
Ah,
So it
yeah.
basically treats the fetus like it's an infection, and then the mom will attack it. So that's another one we avoid.
Yeah.
R is for rubella. That's a vaccinated one. C stands for CMV, cytomegalovirus, as well as chlamydia. That one can also be a problem. And then the H is for herpes. And then S, torches, is for syphilis. So all of these are all things that can lead to developmental problems as well as a lot of brain damage. So that in itself, prior to being born, can already lay down a lot of foundations for some learning disabilities, learning issues, and even behavioral problems down the road. So we have to kind of be aware of these, particularly for when we're looking at like prenatal care and prenatal checkups. And those are pretty routine these days, but sometimes people slip through the cracks, and so that may come as an issue where you might have to lead some have some extra support for some of these folks who may have some of these potential exposures in utero.
Absolutely.
Piggybacking on
Yeah.
Yeah.
erythroblastoses fetalis.
Yeah.
Well, what you mentioned is one, but isn't there a situation where if the Rh positive and negative blood mixes, even that could cause damage to the um, yet unborn baby, right?
Yes.
You want to say something
Sure.
about that?
Yeah. The
That's
Rh
a
factor.
very
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
Yeah,
one.
that's part of our blood type, right? So when you say your blood type, O negative or A positive, right? So the positive and the negative is the Rh factor. So it's a sugar on the surface of our red cells.
Yeah.
And so basically what happens is if a mom doesn't have that gene, they're Rh negative, and they have a child, and say the father has one of those genes that
Yeah.
gets transferred. So if their child comes out positive with Rh factor, then the mom will actually create an immune response to attack the
Oh,
red cells. But the first child
Right.
is protected. They are
okay.
fine. The issue happens is if they have another child. So if they have another child who is Rh positive, Then, when the mom is pregnant, their immune system will start to attack the new fetus, seeing it as, foreign
Yeah.
or dangerous. And that's where we have to intervene. And so we can also come in and we have medications for that now. But again, we screen for that to make
Right.
sure that it's
So
not a
that
problem.
injection has to be given within 48 hours, I think,
There's different
of
points
the
throughout
first delivery, I
during
think, right?
delivery. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting process. But
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of that again comes from the genetics side.
That's really cool. I never like I know some of these bits and pieces where it's like obviously you should avoid getting incredibly sick when you're pregnant and or you should avoid certain things, but hearing just that even just your DNA can then combine to be like, hey, we're actually just making our own issues in here
Yep.
is fascinating and also kind of still gives me a healthy respect for the fact that we still somehow are here and our listeners are somehow listening to this as who they are. It's so cool. As we're moving now from gestational to now a new term, epigenetics. First, what is epigenetics? And also, are there links between epigenetics and gestational? Mhm.
Sure. So epigenetics, firstly, when we look at the term, epi means on above or on top of. So genetics, we just talked about, right? Kind of laying down the framework, the master instructions, if you will, the genes.
Mhm.
So those are already laid down from birth, right? From each parent. But then after we're born, not all of those genes are active at all times. And so when we start thinking about different things throughout life, even just something like puberty, so at those points in our lifetime or certain scenarios like stress, that will then activate or shut off certain genes. And so epigenetics would then be looking at how those are, you know, activated or
Yeah.
deactivated at different points. And that can then lead to, again, more disorders or sometimes even looking at different things like cancers and things like
Yeah.
that later. So at this point, when we're looking at epigenetics, we have identified a couple ways that genes can change, but we call them like methylations and things like that, where the DNA will get locked or basically
Yeah.
unlocked. And so kind of like explaining like you can open the book or you can't open the book, and that can lead to a lot of issues down the road
Yeah.
potentially.
That is what
Mhm.
Dr. Chen is explaining. In another word is that um, one level of information is that ATCG nucleotide code. What he's talking about now is on top of that, the methylations, acetylation, you tied something and put it away. That we're not going to use this part of the genome, or we're going to use this part of the genome. But sequence of DNA that you get, you have no say in it.
Yeah.
That is what you received from your parents. Sure, it could change because of mutations, but you don't want those.
Yeah.
You don't want mutations because if they fall at the wrong place, it could be disastrous, right?
Yes.
But this happens all the time. Epigenetic changes. You're coming in contact with toxins.
Mhm.
Maybe you're not eating healthy. Maybe there's a lot of smoke in the air.
Yeah.
Maybe there are some
Mhm.
other chemicals that somehow will affect, and those changes are that's what is epigenetics.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
just wanted to add that.
absolutely.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, that definitely helps.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at epigenetics, especially now, we can really start looking at that nature and nurture aspect, right?
Yes.
Because the nature has given us the foundations. Now the
Yeah.
nurture is going to change. And so when we're starting to see this, a lot of the studies we've been seeing with epigenetics, especially with like learning, especially and development, we can really look at like twin studies. Particularly when we have identical twins, we call them monozygotic versus fraternal twins, dizygotic. So they have two
Mhm.
egg cells that were fertilized versus
Yeah.
one cell that split. So what we see here is that there's been a lot of studies going on since then. Since I think there was a big one in the 1990s out of the UK where they were essentially tracking identical twins and then looking at their genes and then also how they may have changed over time in different scenarios
Mhm.
and then how that may have led to issues with, or maybe not necessarily issues, but differences in how the twins learn or behave. And so there's tons and tons of these studies about that. And when we start looking at especially identical twins versus fraternal twins, that really, if we see something especially more identical twins, that really tells us there's a higher level of genetic.
Ah,
Versus if we see a lot of similarities in fraternal twins, we see a lot more of the nurture side.
yeah.
And again, we still see a little bit of both, but it's kind of more which side is heavier.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that
And
makes
so when we
sense.
kind of start looking at that, we have a lot of really cool research that's coming out um, now because they've been kind of doing long, many, many year studies that are, finally coming to fruition. And that's, a huge one.
I think Mayo Clinic also had twin studies.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like when I took psychology, it was a lot of twin studies were brought up. I know this is nothing
Yeah.
to, well, it has to do with what we're talking about,
Absolutely.
but it was all a lot about twins. And I took psychology with one of my friends who was a twin. So it was just funny to look at her every so often and be like, hey,
Yeah.
you're a twin.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so
good
just
to know.
another way of thinking about
Yeah.
it is like, let's just say we are identical twins, and um, he grows up in another country, and I grow up in another country, or in
Yeah.
different places,
Parent Trap.
and
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
and
This is the plot of the Parent Trap.
Yes.
but we are identical twins. So
Yes.
that means our DNA is exactly the same. So if I am perhaps more susceptible to certain disease, that I'm getting this infection all over the place, and I'm susceptible to this getting this type of debilitating disease, maybe even cancer. But he is totally protected.
Mhm.
It just doesn't get anything. So
Yeah.
is it something in the DNA?
Mhm.
Of course, it can be in the DNA
Yeah.
because the sequences are the same. Of course, there could be mutations. We don't want those, but this is where the nature or nurture comes into play, that maybe his diet, even his microbiome, or all sorts of things are in such a way that have that epigenetic marks on DNA that makes him immune to certain things that I am more prone to.
Yeah.
So it's a powerful area of research and understanding.
And
That's
we're
really
still working that out. Like,
Yeah.
there's
Definitely.
so many layers to this that, I mean, it's just so hard to tease it all out.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is very interesting to think about how so many things can happen in just totally different, when we have people in two different scenarios,
Right.
raised differently, how that can really show up in health and disease, um, for sure.
Microbiome is really
That's
one
another
of the
big one.
big ones.
Hmm.
I have even heard people advising that wherever you grew up,
Mhm.
go back and eat the local food all over again to
Hmm.
reestablish your microbiome.
That's good. Yeah.
It'll
Really?
come back.
Like go somewhere else. It's you have to. I think my brain's trying to process this. So if you go somewhere else to eat, whether it's where you were from or somewhere new, you have to get acquainted with the food for your microbiome.
Hmm.
So, for example, I grew up in
Mm.
Karachi,
Yeah.
Pakistan. So my microbiome was according to
Mhm.
what I had there.
Yeah.
And that is first almost 18 years of my life like that. But then I move away all of a
Yeah.
sudden. Now I'm in the US. My diet, everything is different.
Yes.
So although I am quite healthy, but in order to reconstitute some of the original microbiome, people suggest that you go and eat the
Oh.
local food where you grew up.
What else should we know about epigenetics in our little infants and toddler study?
So there was another really interesting brain mapping study that was done where they looked at some twins as well, and they looked at different behaviors that were happening throughout their lifespan and
Yeah.
different things. So, for example, they were looking at kids that they were showing kids somebody who was happy and smiling versus somebody who was sad and depressed or something. And so when we look at, facial expressions and emotions versus something that's much more like tactile, right?
Yeah.
So processing versus movement, right? So how that can also affect and map to different parts of the brain. And so even just how we create those pathways, those neural pathways to the brain can be affected just by stimulation. So seeing one thing more than the
Yeah.
other, right? Being exposed
Yeah.
to facial expressions or emotions more at one place can, develop one region of the brain stronger than somebody who's maybe doing a lot more hands-on tactile learning, right? And
Yeah.
that may develop a different motor center of the brain differently. And, so even that at, younger ages can already start to lay down some foundations. And so as adults anyway, when I teach my adult students,
Yeah.
I talk a lot about learning techniques and learning styles, when we say auditory versus visual versus
Yeah.
kinesthetic learners, right?
Mhm.
Because that lateralizes or, we build those pathways in our brain
Mhm.
just as we are exposing to things. So more visual people probably are going to have a stronger, route to their visual cortex in the back of the brain versus auditory people are going to be more temporal lobe
Yeah.
for the auditory hearing and then tactile to the motor centers. And so even that is laid down quite early, and that at least I haven't gotten even further, but I would assume there's probably some epigenetic factors leading to that as well,
Yeah.
activation of the neural pathways,
Yeah.
maybe going into that as well. But I kind of have to read up more on
Yeah.
that
Well,
side.
we talk a lot about like early play and early talking with your infant and early routines and all of that, everything you're saying is just like reinforcing like the need for those components to help us become people,
Yeah.
fully functioning people. Yeah. Is there anything else on epigenetics that we missed that we need to deep dive a little bit more into?
Well, I have another article. I know I did a lot
Yeah,
of
I
deep
appreciate that.
diving.
Mhm.
So there was another article on brain development where they were looking at more behavioral things like just having lack of a parent or maybe having an absent caregiver in life. Also, just childhood traumas, right? At a very young age,
Yes.
that in itself, stress in itself has massive impact on
Yes.
genetics. And that really has a huge impact on learning and developmental
Yeah.
problems down the road. And not only at just the genetic level, but we're also seeing it too at the physiological level, where it can affect things like their hormone production
Mhm.
and hormone regulation in
Yes.
the brain. And so that in itself can eventually end up in cognitive
Yeah.
um, development issues as well. And so when we
Yeah.
start looking at these different young childhood exposure or childhood experiences, right? So stress, trauma, absent parents, or lack of connectivity or social emotional learning,
Yeah.
touch, right? We're talking
Mhm.
about physical contact from parent to
Right.
child. All of those things go into brain development and neuroplasticity and the neural networks. So they're all interconnected and very closely tied together when we're looking at throughout the life spectrum, and especially at a very, very young age, particularly, pre-K kind of
Yes.
background when we're looking at early childhood, because a lot of those are laid down at a very early age, whether
Yeah.
you see it or not. And, immediately, right? That may come up later in life that
Right.
we are just realizing can be affected much earlier.
Absolutely. And when we talk quite a bit about how, and the way we talk about it is your brain chemistry can be altered because of severe trauma, because of severe things that happen. And we hope that those things don't happen to people, but we know that life is messy and not always doesn't always feel fair. Um, but yeah, we do touch on that. And when we get to our social emotional unit, this is a nice little pre-shadowing for how important those early social and emotional moments are. And then when we start talking about brain development, it connects to that social emotional development. So I really love all these little like pieces you're leaving for people to take as we get into further units.
Leaving you guys breadcrumbs.
Yes, we love breadcrumbs. Little foreshadowing.
But also
Yeah.
remember that,
Mhm.
what Dr. Chan said, all these, neural connections that are being made
Mhm.
starts very early on,
Yeah.
all dependent on genetics. But
Mhm.
remember that the process continues
Mhm.
for quite some time.
Yes.
If I'm not wrong, even teenage years,
Yeah,
right?
Yes.
absolutely.
So brain grows and develops, and it has
Yeah.
great capacity for improvement. So at any point, more you use it, more you
Yeah.
challenge it, better neural networks, better outcomes you will have.
Yeah.
And as we've been talking about any poisons, toxins, of course, not by choice. Sometimes
Yeah.
you can't avoid them.
Mhm.
Diet, perhaps,
Yeah.
but making better choices, having healthier lifestyle, exercise
Yeah.
is probably one of the best thing one can do for overall health,
Yeah.
and brain would be one of the big beneficiaries of all that.
Absolutely.
So plasticity
Yes.
is there.
Yes.
Yeah, and building on that plasticity element as well, like we have a lot of data that's kind of showing that, again, as we mentioned, a lot of the younger, when we're a lot younger, our brains are a lot more plastic and they
Mhm.
can really adapt very quickly. And so the nice thing is with young kids, especially, there's a lot of ability to intervene
Yes.
at many stages. We were mentioning avoiding, different chemical exposures. That's going
Yeah.
to be helpful. But then, the other element is the nutritional element, right? Getting
Correct.
all the right
Yeah.
nutrients. So that can also go into brain development just because it may not have all the right pieces to build the brain.
Yeah.
But then also when we start looking at things like just again, the behavioral side. So when we're looking at earlier, we were talking about how trauma and stress and things at a very young age can lead
Right.
to a lot of epigenetic changes.
Mhm.
But then there's also a lot of studies that say that if you find at a young age, if you find somebody who is able to take that role on as like an absent caretaker or creating those physical contact bonds that somebody might need, if we're replacing those with somewhere else, that does also create those pathways to regain some of those pathways and get it back. So
Yeah.
we can start seeing that, especially at a young age, in elementary school. If you find a teacher who's like really, really kind of taking on that role of parent in some cases, not saying that you should, but we do find that when that is provided and for some of those kids, they are able to bounce back a lot more and
Yeah.
catch up
Mhm.
down the road. So it's really important to really think about at these early ages that intervention is key to just
Yeah.
have something there to help to assist with the groundwork.
I can
Yeah.
take that one step
Yeah.
further and say something about, for example, gestational diabetes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even before an infant is born, if exposed to higher levels of glucose, because in an unfortunate situation where mom is not taking care of it
Yeah.
aggressively, that studies are showing that primes that kid to have problems later in
Uh,
life, in their 20s and
yeah.
beyond.
Wow.
So the effects of this early growth and what we get exposed to can linger for a very long time.
That's incredible to think about. There's a lot to talk about in genetics. And so, for anyone who's listening who wants to take a step further, take a human biology class, or are there any other type of classes that you would recommend? Whether, because some of our listeners will be here from Triton and some of our listeners will be at other colleges. Um, any
General biology class
general
would be
biology?
good
Mhm.
just to get the basics.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have, for example, general biology BIS
Mm,
100. I teach
yeah.
that,
Mhm.
so
So, if you're
something.
at Triton, you know
Just
who to
like
look
that,
for.
right? So we actually do cover,
Mm,
perhaps not in this detail, what we talked about today. We do cover a lot of genetics.
mhm.
A slightly upper level course would be BIS 150, Principles of Biology, where we go a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And then if you want to go really high level, then you can take
Yeah.
my biochemistry course. That's where
Mhm.
we go into the molecular
Yeah.
details for science majors.
Yes.
Um,
And that's a specific Triton plug. So if you guys are here at Triton,
of course,
take some
always selling.
classes. Yes, absolutely. All right. So for our listeners, what advice do you have for people if they want to work with infants and toddlers, whether it's as an infant or toddler teacher, whether it's as a nurse or a doctor, or even as a parent? What are some words of wisdom that you would love to impart on them?
I'll go
Okay,
first.
perfect.
So, words of wisdom, that's a difficult one. I do have some words.
Uh-huh.
Well, I would say the best thing you could do for yourself and for your children
Yeah.
is to take care of yourself. Have healthy, good habits. The process does not start at birth for a child. It starts before that.
Mhm.
So the moment of conception and after that,
Yeah.
shortly after that, when pregnancy starts, you need to take care of yourself. Have
Yeah.
good
Mhm.
nutrition, have good thoughts, and challenge your
Mhm.
yet unborn baby,
Mhm.
even in the womb, by having good thoughts,
Mhm.
read something good, watch something good,
Yeah.
breathe
Mhm.
good air,
Yes.
and take all the proper nutritions. And after birth, it's equally important that you challenge your baby.
Mhm.
But for the caregivers or teachers or all the professionals who deal with children, I would not go very scientific. I would say just keep an open mind.
Yeah.
Every individual is different.
Mhm.
The genetic makeup, we can't do much about that, but
Mhm.
how we grow, how we see things, how we perceive things is different for every single individual. And
Absolutely.
we need to sort of keep an open mind and tailor
Yeah.
in whatever profession you are.
Mhm.
We are teachers, and we all know students
Mhm.
learn in many different ways, and we try to cater to them.
Yes. Yes, we do. I don't know
Yeah,
how you're gonna top challenging your
I
baby.
know. Well, I definitely want to build on Dr. Khan because yeah, there's a lot of these things. My big thing would be looking at like interventions.
Yes.
So kind of building on, health, right? Health of yourself, health, and then also, getting all the right nutrients and taking care of yourself. And then for folks who are eventually going to become parents,
Mhm.
right? We also have to really think about, looking at the genetic counseling sides of things as
Yeah.
well. So looking more at the clinical things.
Yeah.
Prenatal screening is absolutely essential. So making sure that they are getting the right
Mhm.
care, testing, as well
Yeah.
as right
Mhm.
education.
Mhm.
OB care will be very essential throughout the continuum, throughout
Yeah.
gestation, but then also looking at even potential risks. So we can look at, different types of diagnostics, even at an
Yeah.
early age. From we're looking at genetic disorders we talked
Yeah.
about earlier, that will help to get a early idea, so we can help and have preventative types of um, different types of therapies available to patients, as
Yeah.
well as even just being aware of what the parents might encounter down
Mhm.
the road. So that's really important for the education of the family and eventually the child
Yeah.
as they grow up. And then really thinking about therapy down the road too, to help to support a lot of these children who are growing with possible, exposures to things. But when we're looking at just everyday, day-to-day things, right, it really does come down to just the simple things,
Yeah.
right? Staying healthy, avoiding these dangerous chemicals as much as possible if they can,
Yeah.
and really just making sure that as future, people who will be working with children, just being aware, like Dr. Khan said, everybody's different. And kids are going to have lots of different backgrounds and
Mhm.
any combinations of these things we talked about
Right.
today. And so it's really just being aware that
Mhm.
they exist and then just understanding that our role is really to help to support them
Yeah.
and help them to, find the right care and support they're going to need down the road. So just being there is really the big thing. Like you said, having someone who cares and helps out, that little bit can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I love how we already talked about how you guys left breadcrumbs. And it's ironic that we talked about you guys leaving breadcrumbs because what is genetics? Like the foundation or something?
Yeah.
And yet here we are with the foundation for everything we'll talk about, even though we're not calling it genetics and we're not labeling it genetics. All of this is the foundation for what comes next. So thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.